Hello, this is Bénédicte de Montlore. Thank you for listening. Before we get started on the last episode of this season, I wanted to let you know that we would love to get your feedback. Tell us what you liked, which guests you want to hear from, and which stories or topic you would like us to explore as we prepare for a brand new Season 2. Visit our website to take a quick survey or just email us at ttaf@frenchculture.org. Thank you.
Et nos amours, faut-il qu'ils m'en souviennent?
Welcome to The Thing About France, a podcast where American cultural figures explore the fascinating and complicated relationship between France and America. I'm Bénédicte de Montlore, and this is The Thing About France. I got to know Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, because of the extraordinary support he gave to a show called Posing Modernity. Because this exhibition shed a new light on Black models in the arts throughout history, the Ford Foundation supported it financially. Darren made sure to put the right people together to make it happen and traveled to Paris for the opening at the Musée d'Orsay. Since then, we also worked together to increase the diversity of our programs. I was intrigued by his enthusiasm for France and wanted to know more about his relationship with my country. We talked about philanthropy and whether cultural institutions can receive money from controversial sources, about the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral, and also about artists in French-speaking Africa and the role of the diaspora. Allez, c'est parti! Hello, Darren Walker, and welcome to The Thing About France, our podcast.
I'm delighted to be here, Benedict. Thank you for inviting me.
No, I really wanted to have you because you're such an important figure for American philanthropy. Not only you're the president of the Ford Foundation, which is the second largest foundation in the US, but you're involved, in fact, in many, many other organizations. In fact, the list is quite impressive. Like you co-chair New York City's Commission on City, Art, Monuments, and Markers. You serve on the boards of Carnegie Hall, the High Line, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and many others. So maybe just to start with that, how did you get involved in philanthropy? What happened?
I came to philanthropy in the most circuitous, zigzagging career trajectory that one could imagine. After a career on Wall Street, I went to Harlem and I led an NGO in Harlem. My long-term career goal was to work on issues of social and political significance that would have an impact on the lives of poor people, low-income people, people of color. And at the time, in the 1990s, I was especially interested in Harlem. And my organization, the Abyssinian Development Corporation, went on to do remarkable things. The Harlem experience is what made it possible for me to come into philanthropy. And that happened because the work that I was doing in Harlem came to the attention of the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And that was the beginning of what has been a magical, almost 20-year journey in American philanthropy.
And I'm very impressed by the role and the power of American philanthropy and how it can change society. As you know, this is something very different in France. I think one of the major, in fact, differences between France and America is the role of philanthropy, because in France we expect the state to do a lot. But at the same time, at the moment, public spending is, of course, decreasing. So we have to invent a model. And I think it's really interesting to look at what's happening in America. Recently, we've been engaged together in this exhibition called The Black Model. And this exhibition really takes some very famous works of art like throughout history, and focuses on the black models that are in those paintings, but nobody noticed. And why I wanted to mention that is that you personally have been extremely involved, and I really see it as something that makes a difference in history of art and the role of foundation in changing society. So can you come back on this history?
Well, the Black Model exhibition is a landmark exhibition for France and for America. It began with a thesis produced by Dr. Denise Morel, who discovered that in the history of 20th century French painting, there were many Black models, and they were represented in, of course, beginning with Manet's Olympia, the foundational painting for modern art as we know modern art. And yet, the scholarship renders the model, Laure, invisible. And Denise Morel undertook an excavation of their identities. Now, of course, no one has more beautiful art than the French. You all have a unique ability to understand and represent beauty in its most pure form. And in this case, the Black figures are indeed beautiful, lively. They are indeed full of dignity. It's just not recognized. Now, the role of the Ford Foundation was to help support three things. The idea that Denise Morel had in her thesis, her dissertation for her PhD. Second, to support Denise specifically as a scholar who needed the financial resources to do the work to produce a catalog, to travel to many, many museums. And then finally, we needed to support the institutions, the Wallach and the Orsay. And so we provided support to what I call the three I's, to the idea, to the individual, and to the institution. So one of the first things that we did was to review a list of dream pictures she would love to have. Among the pictures was the most famous, of course, Manet's Olympia. Denise said to me and to Buffy Easton, who was an advisor to the project, and herself, Buffy said, Denise, there's no way Manet can travel to America. It just simply, the French people would never let that happen. It's one of their national treasures. She said, let me call some friends in Paris and just ask them. And she did speak to some friends in Paris in the art world. And what they advised her was that she was probably right. However, they did say that it might help if American First Lady Michelle Obama were to write to then President Hollande and ask for the painting to travel to America. In some ways, in the way in which the Mona Lisa traveled to the National Gallery under the auspices of Jacqueline Kennedy in the 1960s. Fortunately, I do have a relationship with the First Lady, and I was able to reach her and ask, might she be willing to be a patron for this very ambitious program and to send a letter to President Hollande. And she agreed. A few weeks passed, and we received a call from the French Culture Ministry inviting us to Paris to talk about this inquiry. And so Denise, myself, Buffy Easton, flew to Paris, and there were a set of meetings. They basically said it would be difficult for this picture to leave Paris, but that they wanted to be helpful. And they endorsed the idea of the exhibition and said anything that we can do on behalf of the French people to help make this exhibition happen, we want to do.
Because I feel sometimes show really brings together the best of France and the best of America. You had the best of our curators, our scientific, like history and our paintings, with this, I would say, American political impetus. But me, I'm curious about your role, because you're the president of the Ford Foundation. So to be so involved in one show, that impressed me a lot, I have to say. And so is like really increasing the representation of African American artists or models in art something really important to you? Me, my feeling is that foundations have a big role in that because they make it clear that there is some funding available if institutions do that. But do you agree with that?
Yes, I do agree with that. And let me just start by saying why art matters in a society, and certainly why I think art matters here in America and in France. Art is important because through understanding art, we understand our humanity and we develop empathy. A more empathetic society will be a more just society. And the arts are a pathway to being a more empathetic society. Now, I also believe that museums have reflected the hierarchies of gender, class, race, geography. And so museums have historically not reflected the narratives, the lived experience of Blacks, for example. And so it is only in recent years that we have begun to see a dramatic shift in the way in which curators are treating art with Black subjects and art produced by Black artists and other artists who have been excluded, including women. But there is a unique way in which this has manifested. For example, at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, until recently, the American wing did not include the art of Native Americans. And if you wanted to see the art of Indians who were here when America was created, that was in a separate wing of the museum, along with tribal art and oceanic art. And that is a symbol of the problem and our history marginalizing people. And so
And when would you date back this awareness, like this, like would you say it's the last 10 years or no, it's really...
Well, I think that there has been a protest movement by Black artists going back to the 1960s. So the Whitney had major protests by Black artists because there had been no Black artists really included in the Whitney biennials. The Metropolitan Museum was protested for many of the same reasons. And so I want to not say, well, it's just because of what's happened in the last few years. I want to recognize the struggle of people who are dead and who went to their graves never being recognized and were genius, talent, who today are Alma Thomas, for example, Barclay Hendricks. I mean, there are many artists of color I could think of to mention. But you are right that in the last 5 years, there has been an intensity of focus of people who are saying that in a rapidly demographically changing America, it is no longer acceptable for our museums to be primarily reflecting the white experience, the experience of white Americans, that museums must reflect the experience of the diversity of American society, not to be politically correct, but to be excellent. And in making those demands, It has been through media. It has been through a new generation of art critics, because the critics have a very important role, because the critics help define what is quality and what is not. And so that has been happening in the visual arts especially.
And you, as a foundation, what did you do?
Foundations are the bankers for change. We
I love this
provide
expression, bankers for change.
we provide the financing that helps lubricate the engine of social change and social progress. And so the $600 to $700 million that we give away every year is the watering of the plants that grow, that oxygenate the air for social change.
Yeah, and when I look at the French system, now that I have a better knowledge of the American one, I feel we really miss that, because like our biggest foundation is as big as the 100th foundation, largest foundation in the US. So we don't have anything to compare. Like at the moment, we are looking at how like to have our system evolve. So if you were president of France, what would you do?
Well, how lucky I would be to be president of a great nation like France. Well, I believe that it's not about adopting the American model. France has a unique culture and history. And what France needs is to develop French philanthropy. And that can be informed by some of the best of American philanthropy. But it needs to be rooted in the culture and approaches of the French people. Now, in the United States, we have a government that has encouraged through tax policy the creation of philanthropy, the creation of foundations, has promoted private giving for charities. So that is always, certainly since the 1930s and before, been a part of the American ethic. And so what will the French ethic be? That's the job of the president, to help build a system in France that encourages private philanthropy without ceding the role of democratic institutions and the participation of the citizenry. Because one of the concerns I have, and many critics have about American philanthropy, is that the private sector and the influence of individual wealthy Americans is becoming too great in the public sphere. And so we have to remember that both of our nations are democracies, by the people, for the people. And the risk with yielding to private interests over public needs is very real.
Yeah, and it was pretty obvious recently with Notre Dame's fire. You know, when the fire happened at Notre Dame, very quickly, there were some very generous donations announced by the Pinot and Arnaud family. And at the same time, everybody appreciated it, like the first hours, let's say. And the second day, there was a huge polemic because the French public was like, why didn't they give to the social causes? And the same way, some people were shocked that there was not the same outcry, you know, for the museums that burned in Brazil, or from some churches here in America, African American churches that burned. And here we see it also, like very often polemics about the origin of the money. So how do you navigate that in the US? Because I think it's not only a French concern. Like, how do you make sure that even if your philanthropic system rests on private generosity, you still serve the public good?
I believe this is one of the most critical challenges facing modern philanthropy. First, because the polemic is generated by the enormous inequality we see in society and the degree to which the people who are average citizens feel left out and marginalized and insecure economically and in other ways. And that insecurity is in part why there is so much anger in the streets and why I believe there was some backlash after the announcement of the Pinot and Arnault family gifts. I believe that both of those families have made an enormous contribution to the most iconic site in all of Paris. And of course, there would be a natural affinity for the Notre Dame. And while people might say, well, why didn't they give for this or for that? This is iconic, and this is the heritage of the French people. And I believe, having said that, that people in France, in America, are concerned about how it was generated. And this is what I call the toxic philanthropy question.
Yeah, it's really a question because, Balzac says behind every great fortune, there is a great crime. So what is your point of view on this? Can we take any kind of money from any source and take it and use it for the public good?
Well, first of all, let's remember that the gold standard for American philanthropy is Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. They were so thought of as odious characters that they literally couldn't get charters to give their money away. So these are not new problems. What is new is that we are a more democratic society than we were in 1910. The rapidity of information and knowledge has grown so that the public won't tolerate the kinds of things that the public might have tolerated 100 years ago. And this is something that Martin Luther King in 1968 said about American philanthropy. He said the following: philanthropy is commendable, but it should not allow the philanthropist to overlook the very injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. And what Martin Luther King was saying was, philanthropy has to be about more than just generosity and charity. It has to be about justice and dignity. And in doing so, the philanthropist must interrogate how he or she made their money and to not be satisfied with simply giving back.
But very concretely, you think a cultural institution then shouldn't accept like certain donations?
I think that this is a very slippery slope. I do not agree that cultural institutions must decline gifts from money of controversial figures. I think this has to be on a case-by-case basis. It's highly nuanced and highly contextual. Having said that, I do believe that there is a line that mustn't be crossed. When the integrity of your museum or your cultural organization is put at risk with the very public whose goodwill you rely on. And the problem, the challenge for museum directors and trustees is it's a balancing act. And a slight tip of the scale could throw you off.
I think it's really important for us French to know also what are the questions. It's not as if everything was easy. But maybe to go back to France, or to in fact French as a language and French-speaking countries. When I went to your office, I was impressed by the beautiful photography of Seydou Keita. It's a little boy wearing a beret on his head, and he has a striped shirt. And but at the same time, like I was thinking again about it because I wanted to ask you a question about that. Like, why do you like this picture? Because at the same time, he has like, okay, it's a little boy from Mali, but he has lots of attributes of French. you know, and it's very political. So why do you have this picture? And you know, like African artists whom you like from the French-speaking countries?
Well, let me say that I love Sekou Keita's work because he photographed average citizens in the Francophone countries during the colonial era. And his pictures give people the fullness, the richness of their dignity, and they're vibrant. So these are not downtrodden people. The camera brings you into their lives. And the particular photo that you reference is one that I saw at a gallery, and it immediately captivated me. The markers, as you say, were uniquely French. The beret, his striped shirt, the sort of French sneakers he had on, and his little shorts, and his bicycle was a little French bicycle. He looked so French, and he was African. Of course, this is the power of colonialism, and that's a very fraught topic, of course. But on the other hand, it's this idea of the integration and appropriation of cultures and cultural norms and cultural markers of everyday life that I find so interesting in photography, especially, but in art in general. And so for me, I do love artists whose work is colorful. Nikki de St. Phal, of course, is one of my favorites. It was a remarkable woman. And to be a modern artist, a woman meant you had to be fierce and bold because it was a man's world. And so you had to be clear in what you wanted to achieve. And I just love the vibrancy, the diversity, the ways in which she used color and sculpture to engage.
And the way she explored femininity.
Yes.
Because lots of those women are pregnant. She really was not shy about expressing femininity.
Right. That's right. And that was the boldness.
Yeah.
That was the innovation of her work. And she was unapologetically a woman. And her lived experience and the lived experience of all women was represented in her art.
Yeah, it's really important to put forward those artists. I know that Nikki de St. Phal in France now, she's very recognized, but in the US, she's not that much recognized. And what I've really appreciated over the years is the work we do together to bring to attention some artists that are not still well known in the US. So we've created a program to bring more artists from Francophone countries, from the Maghreb, from Caribbean. And on the opposite direction, we are creating a program to bring more African American artists in France. And I have to say, all the French institutions are extremely excited. Is it only with us French you do that, or do you work with other countries to do the same thing?
Well, the mission of the Ford Foundation is in part to build and strengthen relations between and among nations and peoples. And one of the ways we have done this over decades is by supporting individual arts fellowships, supporting exchanges and travel. And through these programs, we build an understanding between nations, between people, of who we are as people, what is unique about us, and what we share in common, and how our future is inextricably linked. And so we are very proud to partner with you here to advance the exchange of French curators, artists, with Americans, but a particular interest on the African diaspora, because the African diaspora is a global phenomenon.
So what do you mean? You want to connect all these African diaspora from all over the world and connect them together?
Want to connect them to each other, to connect them to a global movement that recognizes that we all are from Africa. We Black people who populate this world wherever we are on this planet. Africa is our home. And wherever we are, we have brought a part of Africa with us that until recently has not been fully embraced by the places we were brought to, the places we migrated to. So this is a global phenomenon, and one of the things that we hope to do at the Ford Foundation is to support and mobilize support for this idea of the heritage of Black people mattering wherever we are in the world.
Yeah, so that means partnering with France because we have many of those artists in France or other countries like
Absolutely.
Brazil.
And we have a history with France. I mean, one of the things that I have always been fascinated by is what a draw France has been for Black creative people. The most notable being, of course, Josephine Baker, but there were countless others. James Baldwin is my favorite because Baldwin had a special relationship with France. In fact, he died in France because he said he felt more at home in France than in America. And so I'm always interested in that unique history that Black artists have had and why they went to France and why they came back and what they brought back with them. And so I believe that this exchange is essential, more important than ever. And it's why we're so happy to be partnering with you.
You often go to Paris. What is your favorite thing to do in Paris?
My favorite thing to do in Paris is to walk along the Seine and the left bank. Of course, the big things are important. I mean, when I was in Paris a couple of years ago, I went to the American ambassadors for a dinner. And I just remember approaching this beautiful house in the most sumptuous and elegant and refined neighborhood in all of Paris and feeling like I was experiencing something out of a fantasy. It was so beautiful, so perfect. But it's the small things when you're sitting at a little bistro in the Marais and watching the people go by, the diversity of people, and realizing that France is a very special place.
What would be your Proustian Madeleine? Something that you eat or smell that would bring you back to France immediately?
Oh, lavender. Lavender makes me think of France because I once took a trip to the South. You know, I was a student with the Eurail pass. And on a train, the lavender just overtook the air, the scent. So I always think of France when I smell lavender.
Thank you, Darren. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful and I think very informative. Like, I learned a lot and I'm sure our listener will. So thank you so much for your time.
It's been a great honor for me. Thank you for having me.
The Thing About France is produced by the Cultural Services of the French Embassy in New York. Special thanks to Sixième Son for our music and to Force Majeure for our look and feel. For more information, visit thethingaboutfrance.com. Allez, c'est fini.